Before 30XX hit 1.0, I spoke with the game's lead developer Chris King to get some insight into the game's journey from early access to launch. It's been a long road with lots of updates, tweaks, and refinements, and that's all thanks to feedback from early access players. Here's what he has to say about how it's been going.
Fantastic. I mean, we've been in early access with the game for a whopping 2.5-ish years. It's funny that you ask that. Right now we're actually building out one of the things that we're doing kind of as we approach 1.0 is kind of building a couple of different informational vectors for players sort of new and old to see, like, what the heck did you guys do for 2.5 years over the course of early access? And I mean, other than just make the game better in every way, shape, and form, we've wildly improved the game's maker tools. Like, I don't know if you saw, so we released our maker update about a month and a half ago now, where we basically took all of the sort of initial level chunk creation stuff what we had when we launched in early access and sort of really expanded that to the max and let people make their entire own levels with whatever, like, stage mechanics, enemy types, flavor they want, basically whatever the heck they want, instead of so we basically started with giving people the tools to sort of make level pieces that would help us with the game, sort of making stuff that fit into what 30XX already was, instead of us giving the tools to let players make whatever the heck they want. So that's kind of what we've done with the game's maker tools. We've added like really robust tools for people to find and play with those levels. By the time 1.0 comes around, we'll have added what, 4/6, 2/3 more level types to the game. So over the course of early access, we added a factory level Dustria and an upside down water level water grav. 1.0 will also come with 2 finale stages that are kind of the capstone of every run, that kind of test everything that you've sort of developed and learned and push both your skills as a player and your build as a character to the limit as you finish off each run. And of course, that's both in mega mode, our death takes you back to stage select, as opposed to death ruins your entire run kind of mode, and standard mode, which is the typical more roguelike mode. We totally revamped the game's meta progression and optional difficulty systems. So we added a whole bunch more sort of potential upgrades and ways to kind of shape your runs that you can unlock and buy as you play the game. We've really smoothed out the new player experience there too. This is something we did a little bit closer to the end of development that I would have liked. We realized we had kind of an issue where if you sort of naturally linked into the game, if you sort of understood it and got to, levels 4 or 5 consistently, you'd unlock things at a very natural clip. But if you were sort of new to the genre and you were dying very frequently on like level 1 or level 2, you wouldn't make a whole lot of progress. So we kind of smoothed that out for new players that have more of a natural on-ramp as they got into the game. We've sort of really forked out our difficulty progression system. So 20xx's difficulty progression system was in the form of a bunch of skulls. We called them skulls because they were based on Halo's skulls. A whole bunch of sort of individual toggles that the player can turn on or off at will to make the game sort of very, binarily more difficult. Like each skull had exactly sort of one intensity rank. This time around, we have about twice as many of those conditions, and most of them have somewhere in between 2 and 4 ranks. So the player has much more granular control over the way that difficulty develops. We really intend for your first victory at entropy 0. Entropy is sort of our name for that difficulty scaling. We intend for a player's first win at entropy 0 kind of to be their entry into the 30xx universe, as opposed to, well, I've beaten it, now what's left. So there are, I think right now entropy goes up to 34. As of 1.0, it will very likely go to 40. There's one more condition we want to add in our last patch for 1.0 here that has a couple more conditions in it. So we've basically really extended all of that. We have, I think, about tripled the number of items in the game that were there when we launched early access. So if you enjoyed run variety at our early access launch, you ain't seen nothing yet, is kind of the short of it. Nina, I think, had 7 weapons or 8 weapons at early access launch. She now has 21 potential modifiers for her buster that all stack together to create, very unique feeling beam combinations. Ace has twice as many weapons he can find, and all of his weapons now have weapon augs he can find as well. So we had this interesting sort of design situation where so Nina, of course, can stack as many beam upgrades as she finds to create, crazy beam combinations, right? So Nina's always really excited to see an opportunity to get a new beam. But when you were playing as Ace, and this problem existed in 20xx as well, if you happen to find your favorite weapon early, all of a sudden you don't really care about opportunities to get new weapons anymore because you already have your favorite. So this time around, once you have found one of Ace's weapons, it also unlocks the potential for you to find a weapon aug that buffs that weapon in a future weapon upgrade. So you might see one of those, you might see a different weapon. So there's always kind of something to be looking forward to, even if you already have your favorite. And every single one of those has one upgrade that sort of upgrades the weapon's base swing itself, and one upgrade that affects the weapon's special unleash. All of Ace's primaries have sort of a secret technique that comes along with them that he sort of has just by virtue of having the weapon without having beaten any bosses or anything. So as Ace now, not only do you have twice as many primary weapons to find, but each of them kind of has its own upgrade path. So even once you find your favorite, are you going to find a cool weapon aug that comes alongside it, or will you not? Will you find other weapons? We've added, I don't think prototypes were in the game at release, or if I think we added prototypes shortly after release. This is an example of, with 30XX, a lot of the reason we made the game in the first place was that there was so much we really felt we'd left on the table with the first game. Like, we're so proud of what we did with 20XX, but we still felt, having finished it, that there's like so much further we could take it. And so over the course of 30XX's development, we tried a bunch of stuff. We said, we've always wondered how X would work or Y would work. And now we're in early access with a new game that's really a better version of the last same game. Let's try all this stuff out. And so one of the things we tried was a change to the prototype aug system, where every prototype you found was this modular combination pulled from a bucket of blessings and a bucket of curses, so that you'd always be seeing, you wouldn't just see a static prototype that always does the same thing. You'd sort of be offered a very powerful benefit with a terrible downside to come alongside it. And there was also kind of a weighting system in there that would try and balance it out. Like, if you got a mediocre blessing with a terrible curse, it might also try and give you a bunch of money or health to kind of go alongside it to justify it. Ultimately, those ended up not being as spicy as we would have liked. It sort of felt like, because we had that balance there, that there was a little bit, it sort of lost a little bit too much of its flavor in the process, and it sort of limited our ability to make sort of fun, unique ones. So ultimately, we went back to a very similar to 20XX prototype system, except this time we sort of got we sort of tried to take the best of both worlds. We took our learnings from the modular prototype system, and instead we have a number of prototypes where the benefit is the same, but the drawback is different. So like, we wanted, for example, there's one crazy good prototype that has to come with the most punishing downsides in the game, because it doubles every aug you find. From the moment you find it, it's called Hysteria. Every other power-up you find is double, right? And of course, unsurprisingly, this is super, super strong. And so we needed, we wanted to still have some variety in what kinds of penalties can show up as a result of that. And so we have both one that I think triples the damage you take, and one that makes all of the damage you take come from your maximum health instead of your regular health, so that you will eventually probably die. So we have a lot of new prototypes like that, where there's sort of a new beneficial effect and then a couple of potential downsides that come with it. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. So I think 20XX maybe had somewhere between a dozen and 18 prototypes. 30XX has, I think, 40 or 42. So we've sort of wildly expanded that from the previous game. And I don't think any of that was there when early access launched. We have 13 repros, up from 8 in 20XX. Those guys weren't in. Repros are the little familiar buddies that follow you around and do cool stuff. I think 30XX early access shipped with 33 to 35 basic augs. There are now like 110 or something. So basically, everything items and character system wise in the game has really just sort of like tripled in amount of various new things there are there. Like, almost twice as many kinds of levels, 3 times as many different kinds of items, which means the sort of run variance you have this time around is just wildly different. We updated every single one of Nina's power fusions. Characters now also have I mentioned a little bit earlier about weapon augs, which are Ace specific. Like, he finds a primary. Now, while he's playing through a run, he can also find a weapon aug that buffs that weapon. Every character also has 2 power augs they can choose to take that buffs one of their boss powers that they may be offered at the end of a subsequent level. So, I finish Burning Temple, I defeat Zen Primus, Nina gets the Zen Mortar, which is the fireball she shoots up, and then it kind of splits both ways. And so she has 2 different power augs that buff that. One of which makes all of her splitting effects split into more projectiles, and one of them gives her energy recovery on any enemy that's slain by those split effects. And all of those power augs also apply to every fusion that uses Zen Mortar. So
Oh.
Zen Mortar, one of Nina's powers, can be combined with the other 7 of her powers, creating, 8 total unique powers, including the base Zen Mortar. And the power augs that Nina finds apply to both the base power and all of the fusions. So you're really kind of crafting this very, very unique loadout every time you play through the game that, just statistically speaking, you're not going to be able to, reliably reproduce. Because you're just not going to be offered, the stages would have to come in a specific order, you'd have to get specific RNG, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So you really have just wild diversity and uniqueness of run loadouts. So freshness of play, freshness of toolkit. That just wasn't there quite so meaningfully when we launched. The guts of the game, the core gameplay, the moment to moment were all really solid in early access launch, but the run variance was not quite there.
Right.
And now it is very, very, very much there along a number of dimensions that just weren't present when we released early access. The other big things since early access launched, I don't think we had leaderboards and challenges when we launched, so we have those now. Very similar to 20XX, except instead of the hardcore version, so 20XX had a regular challenge and a hardcore challenge, which was just a regular challenge with a few of our skulls turned on. We have the vanilla and the flavored challenge. So the vanilla challenge is the regular challenge from 20XX. The flavored challenge does turn on a couple of difficulty modifiers, but also gives the player a unique blessing only found in flavored challenges that gives them some kind of rules benefit in their favor for the entire thing. So we've got those, and of course, those are both in daily and weekly forms. Those work in solo or in co-op. And the co-op, of course, the challenges works local and online, just like the rest of the game's features do. We added a whole whack of weird narrative events that eventually lead to the game's true ending, none of which were in early access as launched. There are a lot of, finishing one run of the game by itself doesn't show you a lot of the stuff going on behind the scenes. There are lots of sort of different side objectives that the game hints at and sort of slowly teaches you how to do that will sort of lead you deeper into the game's narrative and show you more behind the curtain of what's going on with the game. So there are a whole bunch of those. I think it's now about a dozen or so side extra levels that you'll sort of discover and play through as you play through the main campaign. We added accessibility and assist modes. So we added a whole bunch of extra visual options that let the player sort of draw a whole bunch of different colors of outlines around themselves, around enemies, around projectiles. Basically, we know that 30XX is a really vibrant, lush, colorful game, and we want people to sort of be able to tweak those kinds of settings just to make your character really stand out in the event that some of the stuff gets a little hectic for you, because it definitely gets a little hectic sometimes. And we also added assist mode stuff, so you can tweak like enemy health numbers, damage numbers. You can tweak the game's speed clock if you want. Mm-hmm. So if you want the game to run more slowly, or we added, while we were at it, we figured why not make it run more quickly if you wanted to do that too. That's not really assist mode at that point because that's really hard. But we figured we'd throw that in mode. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think that's like the 10,000 foot overview of all of this stuff we've added over the last couple of years, alongside, of course, bug fixes, refinements, balance, all that stuff that's a little bit less exciting to talk about in this context.
Yeah, but it's still good stuff to know, right? For sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I do want to ask you more about Nina, actually, because I mean, she's, she's X, right? The X equivalent of this game. And something so I've noticed while going through a lot.
X.
The blue bomber, some might say.
Blue so-and-so, yeah,
the blue something, right? But so what I've noticed is I've only played through a bit. I've gotten through about like stage 6. That's about as far as I've gotten so far, like, and then maybe like 3 or 4 hours of play.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
And yeah, thank you. And I have noticed, right, that like you were saying, that there's so many different ways to augment just like one ability, where that combined with a combination, like you can combine one power with any other power. I've noticed that creates so much, it feels like complexity in a way where it's like, I want to learn this, but it's also so many options that it's like almost interesting to not learn it and just kind of roll with the punches.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
What I wanted to ask you about is, this is something that I think was an interesting way to twist the idea of like, okay, you can either get all 8 powers, or you can amp up one power and combine it with these other powers. So what was kind of the mental thought behind the idea of combining these powers and making them kind of have different abilities based on your augmentations?
I'm going to give a little shout out to Justin Ma of Subset Games fame, FTL Into the Breach, all of those lovely folks. I was at a PAX with him forever ago, shortly after the release of 20XX, and he made an offhand comment about, it would make this really interesting in a roguelike setting if, there were sort of a lot of reasons. So one of the things that very frequently happens in 20XX is the player finds sort of the 3 powers that they like most, And instead of choosing to sort of menu and swap those powers around as the situation demands, a lot of players would prefer to. So whenever we give you a boss power, we also let you choose a minor stat upgrade or some money to buy stuff with later. And we still do that in 30XX, except instead of the stat upgrade, it's one of these power augs that sort of further modifies and upgrades your weapons further. And he had sort of made an offhand comment about, I noticed a lot of players, including myself, kind of just find the same 3 into this. It would be really interesting if, and he's both to thank and to blame for this idea coming around. Because making every single set of powers have a unique, fun, flavorful interaction to experiment with, discover, and master is very, very satisfying, and also a tremendous amount of work. That was sort of where the initial idea came from. It was this concept of, it was sort of a design modification. It was a design change made to fix a player pattern in 20XX where, for the most part, you'd find your couple of preferred powers and then you would just ignore the rest. Here, you have reasons to consider all of the powers that aren't kind of normally in your main wheelhouse. And in case the sort of free-flowing experimentation you mentioned, there are kind of 2 big vibes that I've kind of worked with the player base over the course of our iteration on Nina's power fusions, because they've been through a couple of sort of iteration and rework passes, a lot of the individual abilities. When we first launched early access, Nina's fusions were bidirectional, meaning power A supported by power B is a different power than power B supported by A. Now they are not, so the order no longer matters. So the overall number of fusions is a little bit lower, but it lets us make each of those fusions much more interesting, as opposed to every single fusion just strictly being, oh, this just feels like one of the powers with the other one's support. All of them are sort of unique abilities that take into account traits of both powers. Right. And yeah, as we have sort of gone back and forth with the player base about this, we wanted to make sure that all of the base powers by themselves are satisfying and fun to use, because we know that there's going to be a subset of the player base that doesn't experiment a whole lot with fusion up front. We also experimented with for a while the idea of those fusion decisions being permanent, as in, you enter a level, you enter lethal tempos, clock zone level, and you already have Zen Mortar and you have Crystal Wave, the splitting fireball and the freeze wave power. We experimented with for a while a system where when you beat lethal tempo and you got his aiming gear, if you wanted to fuse it to one of the other powers, you had to make that decision now and permanently. So if you combine it with Zen Mortar, you would have no choice but to keep the aiming mortar for the rest of the run. You couldn't split them back apart. That feature still exists as one of the optional difficulty toggles. So if you're turning up the heat, you will eventually play with this because it is, more reasonable than some of the other super hard ones. But it's not part of the base game because we had a huge chunk of the player base that just said, this puts too much like choice paralysis in my game stew, and I don't like the way this feels. So we said we have this option for both players. We think it makes a lot of sense for this to be something that kind of naturally kicks in up the difficulty curve some, but you still have the freeform ability to sort of play with it as you want to. Right. But at the same time, on entropy 0, when you first get into the game, 30XX, despite being a roguelike with these, multiple hundreds of power-ups like we described, is completely finishable with nothing. You can finish the entire game without ever picking up a power or an aug. Like, it is theoretically possible. You're going to have to be a god, and the boss fights are going to take you forever, but it is possible. Right. And so we wanted to make sure that part of the reason for players to experiment with fusion, like, we wanted it to kind of be, we wanted multiple sources of motivation for players to want to experiment with that kind of thing. You're always going to have some players that just naturally want to see what all the various combinations do, but you're also going to have some players that just kind of want to go with the flow until they hit resistance, and then they want to sort of start to play around with everything and figure out, okay, I was having fun just kind of vibing around, but now that I'm really coming up against the tough stuff, what do I need to know about the depth this game's systems have to offer that can really optimize my chances of success? And so we wanted that system to appeal to both sets of those players, kind of. Like, I know that I, as a person, very frequently will just like, one of the things that I find the most satisfying in any skill-based or challenging game is when the game gets difficult enough to make me care about the depth of its systems, to make me care about the choices I have in front of me. Like, that's one of the most satisfying parts of all of that for me. So, like, yeah, it was very important that we kind of had that flavor aesthetic in there with Power Fusion.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's really smart too that it's yeah, you can mix and match in the beginning, because then when you get to the harder part where you're challenging yourself, you at least know what the right decision for you is, right?
Bingo.
When you get to it. So yeah, I think it's very clever.
Yeah, and it's very much how the game's kind of like how your knowledge of 30XX and what the fusions do sort of influences the choices you make as you get sort of higher into the difficulty ranks.
I kind of want to turn a little bit to maybe zooming out a bit
Yeah.
beyond 30XX, right? So if we look at the indie scene right now, there's a lot of roguelikes out there. There are a lot of side-scrolling action platformer
Oh
roguelikes.
yeah.
Not that many that are quite like 20XX and 30XX. So how do you kind of see yourself in, if we were to kind of lay out the field of indie side-scrolling roguelikes, how do you feel like you're stacking up to your competition?
I think it is interesting. There aren't a whole lot of, I mean, especially that are released right now. There are very few roguelikes quite like 20XX and 30XX. We try not to think too hard about where we stack up in terms of our competition specifically. I can tell you that in terms of recent stuff, I'm pretty stoked to play Gravity Circuit once we're finally after it 1.0. Obviously, Gravity Circuit's it's a similar kind of Mega Man Zero inspired game. Uh, I'm very excited to play it as a consumer. It's obviously a very different offering than our games are. It's a more handcrafted, specific kind of game as opposed to a replayable sort of like learn the game's ins and outs and play it over and over kind of thing.
Because I'm just thinking, I guess when you look at the granddaddy of it all, Capcom, right? It's only been
Oh yeah.
recently they've been kind of reintroducing Mega Man into their lexicon. It feels like
I
mostly with
hope
like
they
legacy
continue
collections.
to. Yeah,
Same
but
here.
that's not new stuff, right? Like that's
Yeah.
the games industry will continue to sort of like develop in multiple dimensions over time, like all media. Some amount of upcoming media in every given year is going to be the hit media of our youth of yesteryear for any given definition of yesteryear and our youth. It makes a tremendous amount of sense as platforms that all of the beloved Mega Man classics and Mega Man X classics were not on. Of course, they ought to bring it to those platforms eventually. The business case for that is very clear. The cost relative to the benefit it's a very appealing ratio, I think, for anybody making that business decision. I'd obviously love to see Capcom, as a fan, as a Mega Man and Mega Man X fan, I'd love to see Capcom, put together, give me a little X9, give me a little Mega Man 12. Mega Man 11 was really good, and as far as I know, I think its sales were pretty positive as well. As far as I understand, the game itself did very well. I obviously don't know, a game like that when it comes to a company like Capcom. Of course, they're dealing with massive flagships like Monster Hunter and Resident Evil. Obviously, could they almost guarantee making money just making Mega Man games until the end of time? At least for now, yeah. If they could produce another 12, but we don't know what kinds of like corporate business planning kinds of resources those are competing with for things like Resident Evil and Monster Hunter. So like, I would love to have a better like intense understanding of how exactly those decision making processes work over there. I'd love to see more Mega Man content, and I want to know where it is and why it's not here now.
Yeah, I mean, same here. But I am glad that you're at least kind of picking up the torch. Maybe is a lot of pressure, but you're continuing in a way where you're giving sort of adjacent
Yeah, 100%.
content. Yeah.
We're tickling a lot of the same like core flavor aesthetic needs, right? It's the fluid combat, it's the action platforming, it's the excellent movement there, it's the kind of, I don't know, there's a crunchiness to that gameplay that I think we serve very, very well. Like if what you want is the same satisfaction and intensity and challenge that those games and their core gameplay bring, I think we do an absolutely fantastic job of serving that need.
Okay, so I kind of want to dig back more into Nina and Ace, right? I
Yeah.
think when you've gone through a lot of what their augmentations look like, and if you really think about it, it's kind of two very separate games. I mean, they're both 30XX, but they're both
Right. They play
totally
very differently. Your decision trees are very different, yeah.
Yeah, you play very differently. But then as a developer, you have to, I think, consider things differently, where you have to create these enemies where it has to work for both if you're far away with Nina and her Buster, but also can you get up to this boss in time as Ace, or are you screwed, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
do you find it difficult to find a balance between, Buster style gameplay versus sword saber style gameplay?
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of extra consideration that kind of goes along with everything we do. And this is something that we kind of do in many respects across kind of the overall discipline of game development. So many things we do apply to so many different parts of the game. For example, any mechanic or level piece we put in, anything we do to the base game needs to make sense both in standard mode and in mega mode. And anything we add to the game now also needs to make sense in community mode, our new sort of maker content that people can sort of have full free reign with. We're used to every change we make having lots of ramifications. So yes, it adds additional work. And certainly there are designs we could shoot for in a game where Nina was the only character or Ace was the only character that don't make quite as much sense when we have both of those. But it's the kind of sort of plate spinning and balancing that we're like very used to doing across the rest of the project. So it kind of makes a lot of natural sense for us. And it gives us a lot of room to kind of make the characters' play experiences stand out because we deliberately have some encounters. Every encounter obviously needs to be completable as both characters, and every encounter needs to be flawlessable as both characters. There should never be forced damage scenarios unless you made a mistake somewhere, no matter what your toolkit looks like. We're okay with the fact that, generally speaking, playing as Ace is more difficult than playing as Nina. The skill floor there is substantially lower because you have to get up close for the most part to hit things. But sort of at high level play, they have very, very similar faculties, and they allow us to kind of create situations where there are enemies and encounter types that are much easier for Ace to deal with than Nina, and vice versa. And it gives them both kind of a different kind of texture and feel to the way they approach the game world in the different levels. Each of them, when you enter a level, you're thinking, oh, what are the enemy types here? What are the mechanic types here? What do I need to be sort of most mentally present to sort of consider and play around before I get beefed by something? And both characters kind of have different parts of the game that they're worrying about a little bit there when they think about what's coming up, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I think that's great too. And it adds a lot more replay. I mean, a roguelike's already very replayable, but I mean, you can play, dozens, hundreds of hours
100%.
of Nina and then jump into Ace.
Also, Ace is here.
Game.
Yeah, very much by design. One of the big things that we really wanted to make sure we did with 30XX from the get-go was make sure that both of our characters had very unique, distinct feeling toolkits. In 20XX, you may remember, Ace and Nina have different primary weapon loadouts. All of Nina's weapons are, very ranged. All of Ace's weapons were different kinds of melee weapons with different sort of like hitbox patterns and damage and swing speed and stuff like that. And we wanted this time around for them to be entirely different because in the last game, they got the same set of powers from bosses. And this game, their power systems are very different. Their energy recovery systems are very different. So kind of the way that they interact with the game's world and power-ups and progression paths is very different.
So I think you've told us a story about how you came across the artist for this game, right? It's the same person behind Rogue Legacy 1 and 2. But have you told the story about how you're working with City Fires to produce 20XX and 30XX?
It's possible that this one is like, I don't know, a relic of how much time has passed in between when I first met City Fires and now. I'm reasonably confident it was just like a Reddit classifieds ad or something. It was like I think when we first started looking for team members for 20XX, we were looking at like our game dev classifieds and our for hire. I might have done some like Twitter posting, but like not to say my Twitter reach is like incredible now or anything, but I had absolutely zero reach when I was doing this 10 years ago. And I think I honestly responded to an ad and I just absolutely loved the stuff he was coming up with. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case there. Yeah, I know that story's not terribly glamorous, but he's just we've been in love with his work from minute one. Couldn't be happier to have him on.
Yeah, I mean, totally understandable. The second you hear it, it's chiptune-y, but also the modern flair to it. That's just perfect.
Yeah, getting his music into the game and getting to like sort of review his work and like listen for feedback and iteration and stuff like that is always one of the most satisfying parts of the job.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I don't have any more questions for you, but is there anything that you think we should have asked you about that you want our readers to know?
Let's see. I mean, I think we hit so much of the big stuff. Like the big important stuff for us is sort of at a very base level. If you've never heard of 20XX or 30XX, if you are fans of action platformers or Mega Man and Mega Man X specifically, it never ceases to surprise me how frequently we get fans that actually haven't played those games and are just like, hey, this looked kind of cool and I saw the good reviews, so I picked it up and I gave it a try. We get a lot of fans that are not actually big Mega Man or Mega Man X players, so we definitely seem to have pretty broad appeal outside of just that niche. If that kind of action platforming, fluid movement looks fun to you, if you enjoy the kind of action game that is a hybrid of execution focused and knowledge and decision focused, your ability to get through 30XX is always going to be kind of an even split between your actual execution, how well you play the game moment to moment, and the choices you make as you play. And if those kind of flavor aesthetics sound appealing to you, I think we've done a really solid job of kind of getting all of that in a really satisfying package. If 30XX looks great to you, but you just aren't really the type who wants to pay $20-ish for a game, 20XX, the previous game, is also stellar and goes on sale all the time for like $6. Both will be out on both PC and Switch at 1.0 in just a scant. Today's Tuesday, right? It's going to be 15 days, 2 weeks and a day until 1.0. It's a really interesting feeling. I really feel like we should be, everything is on fire mode and, the world is burning down as we come to a release here. I think we're just in really great shape. We're really comfortable with the way the game is shaping up. We're really excited for people to get their hands on all the 1.0 content, the final levels, of course. We added sort of Watergrav, Industria, the sort of stages 7 and 8 over the course of early access, but these last 2 stages haven't been played by anybody except for a very small group of super friends that, sign fancy NDAs and help us test things and get this and that out of the way. So there's a ton of new content that we're excited for people to get their hands on. I'm really in love with how the Switch build of the game plays. I just at this point, because we're done with most of the moment-to-moment work, I just have my Switch dev kit on my nightstand by my bed and just play a couple levels and then save and quit before bed. I'm expecting something to break and it's not breaking, and that's really great. I feel pretty excited about that. I think we've hit on all the really big stuff. You have heard of the game prior. If you weren't familiar with 20XX and 30XX, 2D side-scrolling fluid movement action platformer that's sort of evenly split between execution focus, decision-making focus, wonderful to play alone, local, online with a buddy, both on Switch or on PC. Lots of weird narrative side content that sort of digs into a kind of slightly dark comedy world under the scenes. Or if you are familiar with us and just wanted to know what we've been up to for the last 2.5 years, I think we've pretty exhaustively hit a lot of the sort of 10,000 foot view kinds of buttons over the course of this interview, but there's still just a tremendous amount more stuff there. I think I said at the very beginning of this interview that there's sort of a 3-pronged approach we're taking toward our 1.0 messaging, and there's sort of the trailer end, which is we are assuming most people looking at our trailers for 1.0 have never heard of the game before, and so they will hit on a lot of the same kinds of beats as the top level trailers for early access, because the core promises haven't changed a tremendous amount. Just the variance and implementation and depth of those are the things that we've built and focused and sort of worked on for the last couple of years.
Right.
Then there's sort of the infographic level, where we're taking all of kind of the big bullets and just sort of distilling them all into one image. Here's a very top level look. If you were to look at one image that summarizes the first maybe 10 minutes of me spieling at the beginning of this interview, you would probably get our infographic. And then beneath that, there will also be a sort of very, very detailed list of patch notes summarized that will say, here are kind of not only here is everywhere we've ended up, but kind of here's everything we've experimented on along the way. And hopefully also here's what's coming. Our hope for 1.0 is that it really is, it's our goals for determining when 30XX 1.0 could be is really any time after we felt we had fulfilled our original vision and promise for 30XX. We always kind of intended it to be a little bit of a line in the sand. We would really love to be able to continue to make more content for the game. We'd love to make more playable characters. We might even love to make more stages if finance and time allows. Obviously, those are pretty big undertakings. It would be, from a roguelike perspective, it would be a dream for me if instead of the basic 8 levels and then finale, it was maybe 8 out of a set of 10 or 12 levels. And then the finale, to sort of push the variance and replayability that much further. Because then you wouldn't even necessarily see the same bosses, the same powers that you have access to, anything like that. So we'd obviously love to continue to develop the game after that. But yeah, that's kind of where we are, out on August 9th on Switch and PC. And if any of that sounds fun, read some Steam reviews. I think we've done a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can vouch. It is definitely a lot of fun yeah. And I mean, making those extra stages, that's easy. It's you do it in a day, right?
Just
a day or two.
Just a day. I can hear the headaches my artists are having right now.
Of course, I'm just kidding, but I really appreciate your time here, Chris. Thank you so much for joining the interview. Thanks again to Chris King for doing this interview with us. We really appreciated his time, and we appreciate your time for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed and learned something about 30XX, and if you want to learn more of our thoughts, you can check out our review at TechRaptor.net.